Welcome back to the channel. This is the Action Figure Grader, and I've been wanting to put this video together for a few days. It happened while I was traveling. I was out of the country, but Diamond Distributors announced their bankruptcy, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and I didn't want to rush to get a video out there. I kind of wanted to do some further research on it. There hasn't been much as it relates to this bankruptcy that's been put out on YouTube, mainly as it relates to the comic book industry, as it should, since Diamond was one of the largest comic book distributors, if not the largest. But it does relate for us who collect action figures, graded action figures, because CGA and AFA are affiliated with Diamond. And we're going to talk more about that and kind of dig into a little bit of the details as it relates to the structure of how Diamond is set up relative to CGA. But again, I didn't want to kind of rush to get a video out there because I didn't really know or understand it. So I did speak with a bankruptcy attorney that I know well and who has read the full actual legal filing. And so I wanted to kind of take some notes. So I do have some notes as it relates to that. And on a side note on that, next Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern time, I'm going on to 5 Idiots Talking Toys. Chris W. and all the great guys over there, Shane and Brandon and Charles and John, they invited me on. So I'm sure we're going to be, I don't know how long I'm going to be on there for. I imagine I'll probably be towards the beginning of that live stream on next Sunday. But I am going to be on their channel. I think we're doing it as a live stream. It might just be pre-recorded. I'm not sure. But anyway, next Sunday, the 26th at 9 p.m., we're going to be talking about this along with other topics, I'm sure. But, I wanted to kind of give you guys my thoughts on this because this is a really big deal as it relates to CGA/AFA. It's a big deal, and we want to talk more about kind of what's going on with Diamond. Before I dig in any further, I need to say thank you to Mando Max. Mando Max 55. He sent me a YouTube super the other day, so thank you very much, Mando Max, for sending that. All right, first, let's show the details as it relates to Diamond Distributors for those of you that don't know, and then we'll kind of dig in a little bit to why it's a really big deal as it relates to AFA and maybe some of the repercussions moving forward. So Diamond announced this on January 14th. I was in Mexico when this got announced, but Diamond Comic Distributors files voluntary petition for relief under Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So, again, according to the filing, the actual bankruptcy filing that was put out and read by a friend of mine who's an attorney, he said that there's a roughly $32.6 million of bank debt that was due in January of this month, and so Diamond could not come up with it. It was like a lump sum ballooning payment. So they had to, to file for Chapter 11 restructuring. There's another $40 million of trade debt that they owe, probably as it relates to the comic distribution business, things like that. And so they filed for bankruptcy. They did receive a commitment from Chase, JP Morgan Chase, of $41 million to kind of cover financing ongoing operations as they try to work through this. And as a result, Diamond is going to, sell off a number of other divisions and to help pay for their liabilities. And they already have what's called a stalking horse. I think it's called a stalking horse bid. Received a $39 million stalking horse bid from a Canadian company, Universal Distribution, for Alliance Game Distributors, along with some other stuff. So anyway, it's a mess, right? Especially as it relates to the comic book industry, because they were the largest player. And if you remember, I made a video, I don't know when it was now, but it's on my channel. You know, Marvel and DC Comics, the two biggest comic book distributors, they announced they were separating their partnership from Diamond. Again, this was a while ago, but I made a video about it. I was like, this is kind of a big deal. I didn't think it would lead to Diamond's bankruptcy, but it sure enough did. And, you know, for those that are in the comic book industry, it's kind of a big deal because they're a little bit worried that it could snowball and start to affect, you know, some of the comic book mom and pop shops that are out there that maybe have liabilities, you know, inventory owed from Diamond, whether if they've prepaid for a number of comic books with Diamond, and then Diamond is now not in, you know, a going concern, or there's concern that they're not going to actually be able to fulfill those inventory needs. It could snowball and cause a number of smaller comic book shops to go out of business. I mean, I think that's kind of the concern, and that's what I was talking about with another $40 million of trade debt, right? So if you got comic book shops that have maybe prepaid 6 months worth of inventory with Diamond now files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Do they ever get their inventory back? And, you know, that's a big deal. That's a big deal because it really could severely cramp the comic book industry moving forward. The comic book industry's already been struggling since the pandemic. Obviously, during the pandemic, comic books were booming. Everyone was speculating, and the market was going nuts. Prices were going nuts on CGC graded books, and you know, it was kind of the golden age, the revival for comic books, because everything was being snapped up from speculators and collectors, and you know, everyone was really happy. But since we've come out of the pandemic, you know, obviously there was high inflation, and people started to spend their discretionary income on other things like travel, like my latest trip to Mexico, right? That was an expensive trip for us, and you know, sporting events, live events, all that stuff's come back, and obviously the comic book market has seen a dramatic pullback in prices. And when I say the comic book market, I'm talking about in general, like CGC graded books, things like that. And it's trickled down to current releases, right? You know, that people have, you know, maybe not bought as many books and independent comics and things like that. So Image just announced 3 days ago, so on the 17th, Image pulls comics from Diamond amid Distributors bankruptcy. And as the implications and consequences of Diamond's bankruptcy become clearer, CBR can confirm that Image Comics will no longer allow the company to distribute its titles. Now, Image is a big independent publisher, right? They're the biggest. And so now you got Image, DC, and Marvel that are having their comics pulled from Diamond. And so it's really going to be a mess on the comic book side of things. But that's not the only big deal. And this is something that really hasn't been discussed that much, other than, you know, 5 Idiots Talking Toys and a few other folks. You know, there's been a couple of minor discussions on Facebook, but it's been really surprising the lack of discussion about CGA Grading, AFA. And before we kind of talk about that and maybe what the repercussions are, it's really, really important to make this distinction that was disclosed in the bankruptcy filing. And again, I'm not trying to, when I say all this, this is just based on the information that I've gathered from an attorney. I'm not an expert on this stuff, all right? I am not an attorney. I'm not an expert, but I did speak with a bankruptcy attorney, and as he understands it, after reading through the bankruptcy filing, CGA, you know, they are a division of Diamond. They are not a wholly owned subsidiary of Diamond. So technically, CGA/AFA is part of this bankruptcy based on the bankruptcy filing. Okay, this is based on what I've been told by an attorney. And what does that mean? What is a wholly owned subsidiary versus a division? And so this is important. This is from Google's AI, but it does a really good job of explaining what the difference is. and why this is a big deal as it relates to AFA. A wholly owned subsidiary is a separate legal entity that is entirely owned by a parent company, meaning it functions independently while still being under the parent company's control, whereas a division is simply a part of a larger company. It's not a separate legal entity. It operates within the company structure. And so, legal status. A subsidiary is a distinct legal entity with its own tax ID and own liabilities, while a division is not considered a legal entity and shares the parent company's legal status. CGA Grading, AFA, is a division. It's not a wholly owned subsidiary of Diamond. If you remember, I don't know when it was, a few years ago, Diamond, as part of the Jeppy Family Enterprises, they bought AFA, but it's not a wholly owned subsidiary. They don't have their own, legal entity. And so if Diamond is going bankrupt, technically AFA is part of that bankruptcy. And apparently, they have announced that Diamond is going to sell off a number of assets, and one of those assets that they're going to be selling off is CGA Grading / AFA. And so while parent company has full control over a wholly owned subsidiary, a division operates under the direct control of the parent company's management. So again, a division, I'm speculating a little bit here, but if there is going to be a sale of CGA Grading, then there's going to be some kind of pulling apart of maybe some of these entities, and I'm sure that AFA, I'm speculating on this, but I'm sure that AFA has its own P&L in theory, but they are part of the bankruptcy, meaning that they're on the hook for some of these Diamond Distributors losses and liabilities that are owed. So this does, that's kind of like the legal definition and probably more information that you want. But to break it down really simply, a wholly owned subsidiary is, basically got its own structure. And that's not what AFA / CIB is. Amazon's got a number of different wholly owned subsidiaries like, IMDb, Whole Foods, Twitch, so they've got their own separate P&L, things like that. So Diamond did receive on January 18th, kind of doing it chronologically, they did receive court approval for that $41 million basically revolving credit line, or however you want to call it, from Chase. Debtor, they call it debtor in possession. That's really kind of the legal definition for it. But it's really a credit line to help them sort through their existing operations and liabilities while they work through selling off some of these divisions like the Alliance games and things like that. So they've already got some bids in, but the goal is through JP Morgan Chase to get the best price they can for some of these other operating divisions and sell them off and restructure, pay off their debt, restructure their debt, things like that. So, as it relates to AFA though and CGA, they do have memberships obviously with AFA and CGA. Apparently those memberships will continue, but there are some uncertainties as it relates to CGA's operations because they are interconnected with Diamond and tied together. CGA, I would think, is trying to create a little bit of separation from Diamond, saying, hey, we're kind of our own separate thing. But, I'm sure they've got their own separate P&L and things like that. But under corporate law, they are a division, not a wholly owned subsidiary. So they've got to, they probably are going to get sold off. The question I've got, and again, this is where I'm speculating, okay? The question I've got, number one, is if AFA / CGC Grading, whatever you want to call it, if they were immensely profitable right now, you would think that Jeppy Family Enterprises would want to keep them and figure out a way to kind of pull them out of Diamond, sell off the underperforming assets to help get these liabilities of Diamond under control. but they've apparently said they are going to sell off CGA if they can find a bidder, a buyer for it where it makes sense. So if it was profitable right now, you would think that they wouldn't want to sell it. So I do know that, it feels like to me, looking at, I am a member of, or, I am a customer of AFAs over the years, and I've sent some stuff in recently. I have noticed a little bit more of an uptick in the kind of their, hey, we're out here. Hey, we've got, 30-day turnaround times. Hey, we're going to be at this show. Whereas I feel like before that maybe wasn't the case. They weren't kind of announcing that kind of stuff. And it seems like they've stepped up the urgency with their customers to say, hey, send us your items, and making kind of the marketing case for it. So, I don't know what their books look like or what their business looks like, but I'm sure all of the grading companies have seen a downturn in terms of submissions as we've come out of the pandemic and inflation has kind of eaten into people's budgets. So that's one thing. The second thing is, who's the buyer? Who would be a likely buyer for AFA, CGC, or CGA? And one of them would be CGC, right? I know that CGC has got to be struggling right now with the comic book downturn. So I don't know if Blackstone, which owns CGC Grading, CGC, and all the affiliated kind of businesses, whether they would want it. Obviously AFA, VGA, DCA, CGC Grading, they don't just grade action figures. They also grade video games and, die cast and things like that. So CGC, I would think maybe would want to have some interest, especially as it relates to video games. They would take one of the major competitors out as it relates to video games. And they do have deep pockets, right? Blackstone Group is the owner. They have massively deep pockets. They got deeper pockets than pretty much anybody out there. But if CGC is struggling right now, which I'm sure they are, especially, because they've had other scandals lately, right? They've had the Reholder Gate. They've had the Banana Gate, where the books have been bent inside the books. They've had all kinds of negative press lately that has led to a significant drop off in comic book submissions to CGC. So I would think that they are operating at a loss right now after their massive run up in headcount, their expansion of facilities during the comic book boom times during the pandemic and coming right out of the pandemic. But I have to believe that CGC would give pause to buy anything right now, just given everything that's going on. So that's one competitor. I mean, could Collector Archive Services, could UKG Grading, could some of those companies buy it? I don't know. Maybe Jeppy Family Enterprises just ends up holding on to it because there's no good likely partner for CGA Grading. But I do think that the likely buyer has to make sense. And I don't know, other than CAS or UKG, really, who else really makes sense from the action figure or the action figure collectible side of the business? Does CGC really want to get into action figure grading? And they just don't have the expertise unless they just keep the folks at AFA, obviously. The other idea would be maybe some of the principals at AFA buying it back. They sold it off to Jeppy Family Enterprises. Maybe they buy it back if it's back on the block and they get it for half price. Who knows? So that's one thing. The other thing is that they did not mention Hakes. Hakes is another entity or, company that is owned by Jeppy Family Enterprises. And we talked about the natural synergy between CGA Grading and Hakes. You could send your stuff in to CGA Grading /AFA, and then they would immediately ship it over to Hakes and sell it off and auction it off. Now, Hakes was not mentioned, so I'm sure they're probably pretty profitable. Maybe they're doing their own thing. I don't know. Maybe they're their own wholly owned subsidiary versus a division of Jeppy. So, but given that this bankruptcy filing laid it out very clearly that CGA Grading is a division and not a wholly owned subsidiary, I want to get that, stress that point because, from a legal perspective, they are part of this bankruptcy. They're going to be sold off apparently. And there is some inherent, this is me again speculating here, but if let's say I've got $100,000 of mint on cards that I'm thinking about sending out to be graded right now, I don't know if I would send them out right now. I mean, until this thing gets kind of settled, or CGA Grading potentially gets bought by another company and starts doing its own thing again, and it's kind of extricated out of this bankruptcy process, I'm not sure I would be sending in massive items. Do I think that there's a risk that you lose your items? Probably not, really. I mean, probably not. I think if you got stuff at AFA right now, everything's going to be fine. They've got their operations in place. They've made it very clear that everything's business as usual. Their website's working fine. You can submit anything you want. But I'm just saying, if I have a bunch of stuff in my backlog in my collection room, I don't know if now's really the greatest time to be sending stuff out right now until all of this gets sorted out. That's my personal opinion on it. Again, it just there's a lot of moving pieces when you have a bankruptcy. A lot of stuff has to get approved by the courts, to pay off these bills. And they've already got, obviously it's called the debtor in possession financing agreement. Basically, it's a credit line to sort through and give them time to sort through selling off some of these other assets like CGA Grading. But again, to me, while they restructure right now, and if they can't get their restructuring done, they're going to have to do, I guess they'll do a Chapter 7 bankruptcy where they'll just shut everything down. I think it's really unlikely that happens, though, especially given that they've already got a stalking horse bid from that Canadian company for some of their assets. And I would imagine if there is a likely buyer for assets like CGA Grading, those are coming out of the woodwork right now as I make this video. So anyway, I hope all of that makes sense. And I'm not sure I'm telling you really much of anything that you maybe don't already know. But to me, I think the biggest thing to come out of this bankruptcy filing is, the idea of a division versus wholly owned subsidiary, and how that affects, what CGA does going forward. So we'll certainly see what happens, and I'm sure I'm going to talk more about it with the guys over at 5 Idiots Talking Toys next Sunday. But I hope you enjoyed kind of this peek behind the curtain after my talk with an attorney friend of mine that does this he's a local guy here that I know very well, and he's been a longtime friend of mine. So he kind of gave me the lowdown on it, since he's a comic book collector and likes to dig into this stuff. So thank you, as always, for watching. Please be sure to leave me a like if you enjoyed the video, and I'll be back soon.